in 2020. And it was put together, led, I think initiated actually by Canterbury and originally John Hopkins at Canterbury. And we came together, just people working on international law and disasters more broadly. And we decided to create a network in a space where we can explore these questions, not just with each other, but also with the broader community. And we're still growing our network and community. So therefore, it's really great to see you all here. IDEAL, for those of you who don't know, stands for International Disaster and Emergency Law Network. So without further ado, I shall introduce our speaker today. We're very happy to have with us Dr. Cristiano D'Orsi. Cristiano is a research fellow and lecturer at the University of Johannesburg. He is a well-known expert on migration, human rights, and international law, in particularly in the African region. We're very lucky to have him join us to talk about his work on climate-induced displacement in the Sahel, a question of classification. So without further ado, Cristiano, please take it away.
Yes, thank you so much, Mary, for the very nice presentation, and thank you everyone to be present and to attend this presentation. That first of all, I would like to extend the regards from my co-author, because we were two authoring this article that has been published in the last issue. Actually, I think it needs to be still published in these days, of the International Review of the Red Cross on the displacement in Sahel and the climate-induced displacement. So Dr. Naldi told me to say hi to all of you and thanks for the invitation. He couldn't be here today, so I will also present on his behalf. Well, let's start to say that the Sahel region is being adversely affected by climate change, leading to the displacement of thousands of people, both cross-border migrants and IDPs, internally displaced persons. The conventional stance is that the refugee status does not extend to individuals displaced as a result of natural or environmental catastrophes, and that consequently normative gaps exist in international refugee law, as we see afterwards. However, the position in international law may not be as clear-cut as this conventional view assumes, in light of recent trends which are moving towards the recognition of the rights of such displaced people. It seems clear that under the terms of the 1951 Refugee Convention, such people are excluded from refugee status. And while the situation is less obvious under the OIU Convention on refugee status, that has been adopted in 1969, it appears that the end result is the same, although there seems to be an increasing desire for recognition of refugee status under that treaty, in fact. Other regional treaties are taking tentative steps in this direction. The 2009 Kampala Convention on IDPs, that's called the Kampala Convention, is especially noteworthy because it makes express references to circumstances such as natural disasters. Mostly, I mean, in three articles, Articles 1K, Articles 44F, and Articles 12.3.
I think we've lost you a little bit, Cristiano.
I was a bit concerned about this this particular where I don't mind, of course, to repeat. If you can tell me what was the last thing that I have to repeat, please. I will do that.
If you take it from when you first mentioned the Kampala Convention, and then you can take it from there.
Okay, the Kampala Convention. Sure. Yeah, I mean, the Kampala Convention is especially noteworthy because it makes express references to circumstances such as natural disasters, particularly in Article 1K, that defines IDPs, Article 44F, and Article 12.3. And Article 1K defines IDPs, I'm quoting, as person or group of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee or to leave their home or place of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situation of generalized violence, violation of human rights, or natural or human-made disasters. and will not cross an international recognized state border. The broad scope of the definition adopted by the Kampala Convention is notable. It expressly refers to circumstances such as natural disaster. Internal displacement in Article 1L is defined as the involuntary or forced movement, evacuation or relocation of person or group of persons within internationally recognized state borders. The Kampala Convention, in fact, is the only binding legal instrument at the moment that defines and protects IDPs all around the world. And it's interesting that it's an African instrument, because African many times have been accused not to be very productive in terms of legislation, and but this was a very noteworthy attempt, in fact, of trying to create norms on a very timely and important plight in Africa, as everywhere in the world, in fact. Clearly, and following from what I said, forced displacement because of natural disaster comes with the scope of this definition, and is also apparent from other treaty provisions. Kampala Convention protects against arbitrary displacement, which includes forced evacuation caused by natural disaster, where the evacuation are not necessitated by health and safety reasons. And this is the Article 44F that I was mentioning before. A human rights approach may offer hope to displaced persons, since climate change can impact on a number of rights. Particularly significant in this is the decision of the UN Human Rights Committee in the Ethiopia versus New Zealand case, which acknowledged the harmful impact of climate change. The displacement in Sahel has been ongoing for a number of years, but continues to increase to alarming levels. The forcibly displacement can be divided into two main categories. Firstly, those who, by virtue of seeking refuge in another state, may have to claim to refugee status under international law, sometimes referred to as cross-border migrants. And secondly, those who are uprooted from their homes, but remain within the borders of their own disaster-affected country, and are therefore classified as IDPs, of course. The conventional stance is, as I mentioned before, is that the refugee status does not encompass individuals displaced because of natural disaster or environmental catastrophes. Whatever the cause, be they sudden onset events such as volcanic eruption or flooding, which may pose an immediate threat to life, or slow onset events such as the desertification or rising sea levels, which may eventually make life untenable. Consequently, to quoting Professor McAdam in one of her work in 2012, cross-border displacement stemming from natural disaster and the effects of climate change has been identified as a normative gap in the international legal protection regime. Indeed, the position in international law may not be as clear-cut as the traditional view supposes in light of normative regimes, and explores recent trends towards the legal recognition of the rights of people displaced because of climate change. Particularly coming to the Sahel, because of course this is a region that is not everyone, of course, has familiar with this particular region of Africa. The Sahel, that Sahel is an Arabic word meaning coast or shore, is a semi-arid region of sub-Saharan Africa that experiences a hot, sunny, and dry climate all around here. It's bordered by the Sahara Desert to the north and savannas to the south, and stretches from Sudan in the east to Senegal in the west, taking in all or parts of particularly 5 countries. There are Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mauritania, and Mali. And that's, the 5 countries which our research was focused on. In recent decades, the Sahel has experienced drought, desertification, and soil loss, which the UN, in partnership with African countries, is attempting to reverse, such as low onset environmental degradation, which may be attributable partially to local human activity, but is also attributable to global climate change, has given rise to food insecurity. It has additionally contributed to increased communal violence and armed conflict situation, possibly involving organized armed groups, leading to the forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of people across the region. According to the UN Security Council Joint Force of the Group of Five for the Sahel, this was a 2021 report of the Secretary General of May 10, 2021. At paragraph 4, I'm quoting, the latest available data indicate that in 2021, 6 million people were food insecure in Sahel countries. The threat of famine is now looming in Burkina Faso. Also, since 2018, in the Liptako-Gourma region, always in Burkina Faso, the number of IDPs has risen 20-fold. In Sahel state, close to 2.2 million people were internally displaced, and more than 8,800 people were refugees. Large-scale displacement continue to have an impact on state service provision and the availability of natural resources, further exacerbating tension and social conflict. I mentioned these 5 countries before. I recall them. They are Chad, Niger, Mauritania, Mali, and Burkina Faso, and they form the so-called G5 Sahel. What is this G5 Sahel? The G5 Sahel is an institutional framework for coordination of regional cooperation in development policies and security matters in West Africa. It was formed on 16 February 2014 in Nouakchott, the capital of Mauritania, at the summit of the 5 countries that I just mentioned, and is permanently seated in Mauritania as well. Later in 2014, it adopted a convention of establishment. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees recognized the threat posed by climate change to the displaced. In 2018, the Global Compact for Refugees, UNHCR acknowledged that in paragraph 8, climate, environmental degradation, and natural disaster increasingly interact with drivers of refugee movements. The Sahel assumed a higher priority for UNHCR in 2020. On 33rd July 2020, the African Development Bank, UNHCR, and the G5 Sahel that I just mentioned signed an agreement to allocate $20 million to the COVID-19 response across the Sahel region. What is the 2022 situation overview? I mean, of course, in this first month of 2022, it seems that the forced displacement in Sahel is at an unprecedented high, with over 4 million refugees and IDPs across the region, increasingly concentrated around urban centers, creating additional strain on land availability, housing, public services, and livelihoods. This is a report of UNHCR of a couple of weeks ago, in fact. Yeah. Human rights may offer a gainful route to the protection of persons forcibly displaced because of natural disaster. In this context, it is important to note that the African Charter on Human and People Rights, the so-called Banjul Charter, because it's been adopted in Banjul, the capital of Gambia, applies to displaced persons. The argument that the nexus exists between the protection of the environment and the realization of human rights is increasingly gaining traction. Additionally, UNHCR has recognized that human rights violation can amount to persecution. Human rights that may be at stake include a number of first and second generation rights, such as the right to life, the right to water, the right to food, and the right to health. It's now clearly established in human rights law that states have assumed both positive and negative obligations in this regard, and consequently, environmental hazards and that have adverse effects on human beings and are caused directly or indirectly by state action or inaction may lead to a breach of the state human rights obligation. The European Court of Human Rights pioneered this concept through the employment of the doctrine of implied rights, and the recent developments have continued this approach of securing environmental protection via the interpretation of other rights, with particular emphasis being placed on the right to life. However, it should be observed that in the context of natural hazard, I'm quoting the case of the judgment of Budayeva versus Russia, beyond human control, the European Court of Human Rights grants states a considerable margin of appreciation. I mentioned before this groundbreaking decision by the UN Human Rights Committee, that is the Teitioa versus New Zealand. It was in which case the applicant, Mr. Teitioa, along with his wife, having had his claim for asylum as a refugee or protected person rejected by New Zealand authorities, and having exhausted all domestic remedies, complained that by removing him and his wife to Kiribati, New Zealand had violated his right to life under Article 6 of the Pact of Civil and Political Rights. The UN Human Rights Committee, in this case, made the point that, as paragraph 9.4, that environmental degradation and climate change, I'm quoting, constitute some of the most pressing and serious threats to the right to life, in fact. While the threat to Kiribati was a slow onset one, the Human Rights Committee accepted that the situation there could become incompatible with the right to life. It determined that in protecting the right to life, always in paragraph 9.4, states had to take account of reasonably foreseeable threats and life-threatening situations. While the Human Rights Committee concluded that on the facts, New Zealand had not violated the applicant's right to life in that there was no prospect of imminent harm, this decision is nevertheless important because of the reasoning on the impact of climate change. And it's significant that the right to a healthy environment is recognized as an autonomous right also in the Banjul Charter, that in Article 22.4 in Africa. Afterwards, there is also a couple of decisions by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, but I prefer to skip them to focus more on Africa. Climate change, just because otherwise I think that I'm running out of time. Let's see a bit about the efficacy of sub-regional legislation and policy in the Sahel in tackling the plight of climate-induced displaced persons. At the sub-regional level, the 5 states that I'm taking into consideration in the Sahel are all party to the Community of Sahel-Saharan States, the so-called SAN-SAD, whose treaty establishing in its Article 1 consider free movement of people as a core objective of the sub-regional economic community. Article 1 stipulates that the same right, advantages, and obligation granted to a member state's own citizen should be applied to nationals of the signatory countries in conformity with the provision of their respective constitution. Implementation of this specific objective has been stagnant, but a number of SAN-SAD member states have been increasingly liberalizing their policy and have successfully implemented schemes to foster the inter-regional movement of people. Those countries that have overlapping membership with ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, tend to be further along in liberalizing their cross-border mobility restrictions. Burkina, Mali, and Niger, in fact, are all the 3 members also ECOWAS members, while Chad and Mauritania, they are not. The recognition of the need for economic integration, including the free flow of persons, goods, and services, stimulated the enactment of the ECOWAS protocol relating to the free movement of persons, residence, and establishment in 1979. The first phase of the protocol guaranteed free entry of citizens from member states without visa for 90 days and was ratified by all member states in 1980. The second phase of the protocol concerning the right of residence became effective in July 1986, and all member states ratified it. In contrast, the right to establishment is contained in a 1990 supplementary protocol on the implementation of the third phase of the ECOWAS protocol. This supplementary protocol entitles nationals of member states to settle or establish in ECOWAS states and to carry out business activities under the same conditions that apply to nationals in the host states. However, the supplementary protocol, much like the 1979 protocol, did not include any special provision concerning forced displacement because of natural disaster in the region. To further develop its policy of mobility within the region, ECOWAS introduced this sub-regional passport in 2000. While the passport aims to facilitate the movement of people, the challenge remains that those most vulnerable to climate change are frequently the most disadvantaged and least able to move. In fact, this is something that the ECOWAS should also deal with. On the other hand, the five governments of the G5, I remember the country, Burkina, Chad, Niger, Mali, and Mauritania, have made a commitment to place the protection of the displaced person and their host communities at the core of the action. On 12 October 2020, these five governments launched the so-called Bamako process, Bamako being the capital of Mali, an intergovernmental platform for concrete and rapid actions to strengthen coordination between security and humanitarian actors and to ensure humanitarian access, protection, and assistance to affected populations. The five areas of intervention on which the Bamako process focused are, I'm quoting Article 1, humanitarian access and civil-military coordination, protection in the context of the UN framework for the prevention of violent extremism, access to asylum in the context of mass influx and mixed movement, 4, solution for refugees, IDPs, and other civilian population, 5, access to civil registration, identity documents, and nationalities. This intergovernmental process represents the implementation of the conclusion adopting during the 2019 regional dialogue among the 5 countries that also produced the Bamako Declaration, in which the representatives of the 5 governments showed a willingness to reinforce cooperation in order to enhance the protection of the forcibly displaced in the region. Although the topic of the environmental displaced is not explicitly mentioned, several of the recommendations in the Bamako Declaration apply to the category of forced displacement because of climate-induced disaster too. For example, the governments agreed to strengthen coordination between humanitarian actors on the ground on one side and local authorities on the other side in order to more easily have access to persons in affected areas of the region. In addition, the 5 governments agreed to reinforce partnership with local communities in situations of emergency, of course, also emergency, also in case of emergency of climate change, to fill possible lacunae where access by humanitarian actors is limited or difficult, and to put in place an alert system allowing for a better coordination between countries in the case of cross-border movement. Finally, the governments of the 5 countries committed to implementing the Kampala Convention, given that those countries have already ratified it. In fact, one of the problems of the Kampala Convention is not the number of countries that ratified it, but it's really the implementation on a state basis. I'm just arriving at the end of my short presentation. In Africa, climate change has consequences in terms of human displacement, and its impact progressively increased over the years. However, given the complex relationship between displacement and climate change, it's worth recalling that climate hazards do not automatically lead to displacement. The Sahel region is experiencing adverse effects because of climate change. This in turn is displacing thousands of people, some into neighboring countries, others within the affected states. One of the questions at stake is whether cross-border climate-induced forcibly displaced persons are entitled to refugee status under international law. I'm in accord on this with the weight of opinion that persons forcibly displaced because of natural disaster cannot, on that basis alone, satisfy the criteria for refugee status under the Refugee Convention. But sometimes we see that the displacement because of natural disaster can be linked on one of the causes by which refugee status is admitted under the Refugee Convention. The situation with regard to the OIU Refugee Convention is less clear-cut, since its refugee definition may be open to interpretation that extends to situations affected by climate change. Although there is a majority of the experts that they think that also in this case, climate change is not really included in the convention. Opinion on this question is divided, although it seems that the argument in favor of a liberal and inclusive interpretation are gaining ground, although it's still minoritarian. In cases where people do not qualify as refugees but are clearly susceptible to harm, complementary forms of protection should be offered by states, for example, giving them provisional, temporary hospitality. However, it's arguably feasible that the criteria for refugee status could be satisfied on human rights grounds, including the right to life, the right to non-discrimination, the right to liberty and security of person, the right to food, to water, to housing, and the right to a healthy environment, among others. The position with regards to IDPs is given legal certainty by the Kampala Convention. African states have the primary responsibility to prevent displacement and protect the internally displaced. The UN Environment Programme has suggested that forced displacement in the Sahel can be minimized by investing resource disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation to enhance the resilience of local communities, while simultaneously strengthening humanitarian action to meet the challenges of climate change, for example, by enacting measures to ensure assistance and protection for people displaced by environmental factors. Given the difficulties that persons possibly displaced because of natural disaster face in meeting the grounds for refugee status under the 1951 Refugee Convention, a relevant question for states is whether the Refugee Convention should be amended to include climate change as such a ground. Alternatively, an additional protocol to that effect could be drafted. Similar consideration arise in relation to regional treaties that at the moment they don't consider the protection of displaced because of natural disasters. While such steps would help to address the issue, one key challenge is the political will for such change. And in Africa, the political will is fundamental in many instances. At the sub-regional level, the ICRC, the Red Cross, believes that more importance should be given to institutions such like the G5 Sahel. Among its objectives, this institution, as I mentioned before, guarantees conditions of security amid its member states and offers a strategic framework of intervention to enhance the living standards of its population, at the same time promoting durable solutions and inclusive development in the region. Within this framework, in November 2020, the meeting in Bamako confirmed that the challenges posed by climate change and natural disaster remain one of the top priorities for the G5 Sahel, presently and in the future. Because as these phenomena cause the displacement of population, they may negatively impact on the development of the 5 countries. In 2016, the former president of Burkina Faso, Mr. Roch Kabore, said, I'm quoting him, I'm translating from French because I mean, the original declaration was in French. Facing this plight, natural disaster among others, the aspiration of leaving one place of origin is natural and legitimate. Better still, it's a fundamental human right. This is why President Kabore appealed not only for sub-regional and regional, African cooperation, but more generally for world cooperation. It's clear that an improvement in relation in the context of G5 Sahel would certainly have positive effects on the policy of its 5 member states, vis-a-vis the condition of person forcibly displaced because of natural disaster. In this regard, and I'm concluding, in 2000, an important African academic, Zachary Lomo from Tanzania, argued that many African states have failed to enact laws indispensable to creating the institutional framework to give effect to the international human rights protection regime. This was in 2000. While I may not agree with the statement, after 25 years, perhaps Lomo also has changed his mind on this point. I believe that he is still correct when affirming that many people throughout the continent are not always aware of their rights and are thus vulnerable to manipulation and coercion. Thank you so much for having listened to this short presentation.
Thank you, Cristiano, for this fantastic presentation. Very rich, I think, overview of the legal situation on this topic. First of all, I have, as always, some questions, but I will not abuse my privilege as the chair. So first of all, if you want to ask a question, please, you can pop it in the chat, but even better, you could just raise your hand and just ask a question. So we're trying to keep this as open and informal as possible.
Yeah, of course. I mean, our article was impactful.
Susan.
Cristiano, thanks. That was a fantastic presentation. I'm still trying to get my head around this issue of refugees and displaced persons. And I should just tell you that I was recently involved in a meeting with the UN Network on Migration. And of course, this is a major topic of conversation. I agree with you. It's not only a top priority in Africa, it seems to be a top priority in Europe too, because of, and I'm sure you've heard about the horrific proposal about putting climate refugees back to Rwanda when they arrive in the UK by boat. So this is, I mean, to me, it's becoming quite an urgent issue that we deal with this. I'm not sure I agree with you, with the greatest of respect, about the refugees. There needs to be, it seems to me, a discussion of what a refugee means when you look at a catastrophic situation like climate change, when places literally become uninhabitable. And so are you proposing that there be another international convention along with the regional efforts that seem to be going on? So maybe you could expand about that a bit, because I'm not criticizing, I'm just trying to wrestle with this in my head.
Sure. I can respond now, or I have to take other questions?
You can answer now, and then Chris, I can see, has his hand up for later. You can answer now.
Yes. Thank you so much, in fact, for the question. Yes, it's funny because about the situation in Rwanda, I just wrote a short piece for the conversation, the African edition, last week. And I also was involved in several talks on media here in South Africa, also in England. And also it's a very timely, in fact, problem. To respond more properly to your question, well, as we try to mention also in our article, it's true that this problem of climate change, I mean, is increasing enormously, and it poses a lot of problem also for displaced, and has you know, the alternative, in fact, are twofold. I mean, either the main instrument for the protection of refugees is the 1951 convention. That is also the one that, for example, the British government now is invoking to say that is not in.
We lost you again there, Cristiano. Hopefully we'll come back in a second. or maybe not. In the meantime, if anyone else has, I can say, input on Susan's question, please feel free to just put on your microphone and start talking. I think we may have lost him there. This is going very well. Does anyone else have any thoughts?
It was a great presentation. We've gotten
we got through the presentation all right. I'm very pleased with that. You know, we're winning on that point. I'm curious then, Susan, if you think obviously expanding the refugee definition, would that mean revisiting then the original refugee convention? Would that be actually changing the definition? Would that be what you would propose?
Well, I think that's the discussion that I've been hearing about, certainly.
Okay.
You know, because when Cristiano talked about the right to life, the fact is this is existential threat. You know, I'd be interested about what Chris Hilson says, because in terms of climate change, to me, this is a whole new level. And what worries me is, of course, on the other side, you get, oh, they're just economic migrants. And, you know, I did a project on the drowned refugees in the Mediterranean. And I mean, they were fleeing because, you know, and when you hear about it, they were fleeing because they wanted to live. It wasn't just about working, it's about food, it's about shelter. And, you know, I lived in Australia and the discussion was the sinking islands, the fact that these places are going to be uninhabitable. So to me, what Cristiano is saying is basically, I think that's the situation that's going on.
So
thank
you. Maybe Chris, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm happy to raise my questions as well. We can float them again if and when Cristiano reappears. But I mean, I think this it's really tricky because what Susan says is absolutely right about climate change. But I think one of the issues I think I had with Cristiano's presentation as well, and the question I was going to ask him was about how you disentangle climate change from, you know, the many other factors that lead to displacement. You know, and he said that himself towards the end of the presentation, that climate change is just an exacerbating factor in amongst many others, and that's particularly true in the Sahel. And you know, both climate change has led to conflict, but you know, there are also other causes of conflict in the region. You know, and those are also giving rise to displacement. So I suppose, and I see Cristiano has now reappeared. My question is, you know, how do you strip out climate change? I mean, you know, we're interested, and as a climate lawyer, I'm particularly interested in seeing climate change separately, and you know, trying to look at it and you know, think about how it relates to displacement. But when it is so entangled with all of these other elements, you know, how the temptation is for us to say, okay, well, we've got to do something about climate change, and there's got to be some kind of remedy in relation to climate change. But when there are all of these other factors going on, I think it becomes incredibly hard to determine exactly what the kind of climate solution to this should be, you know, and if there is one. And I suppose, you know, to come back to Susan's point, I'm not convinced that for that reason that states will ever actually really agree to these changes, because you know, they will make very similar arguments that, you know, climate change is just one factor amongst many, so why should we treat this differently? It's just part and parcel of, you know, the whole range of things that we're already thinking about. And secondly, I mean, if they do try and strip it out and do things differently, I think the scale of the climate change refugee problem, you know, as it's emerging and will continue to emerge, sadly, unless we get things right on climate change, is so massive that very few states are going to want to sign up to something as open-ended in terms of kind of changing refugee status on that. So, you know, we as lawyers may try and push for that, but I really think, you know, the reality of the situation is that it will be a very, you know, tough ask in terms of getting that through. Yeah, I mean, Cristiano, I hope you can hear us now. Now you're back with us. But I mean, so can I try and kind of get back to what my question was? One was, yeah, how can you strip out climate change from all of the other factors that are affecting displacement? I mean, I know you identified that, but how do you see that affecting your argument in the paper, I suppose? And the second point I wanted to make, and this may be slightly unfair, Cristiano, because I really enjoyed your paper, and it was very focused on legal gaps and what the law can do here. But I suppose I was wondering whether you need to step back and ask a prior question in Sahel in particular to say, well, is this a problem actually at the moment in terms of people being displaced and not getting refugee status when they want it? I mean, how many people do we know how many people have approached organizations looking for refugee status? Do we know in what numbers they've been turned down? This is particularly an issue because, I mean, in the Sahel, many of those borders are very porous, aren't they? And have long been porous. And there's a tradition of cross-border movement by kind of cattle ranchers and others that's gone on for centuries. Yeah, so I'm just kind of wondering whether you can talk about the legal solutions without having kind of first identified the practical problems there and how the legal solutions will map on to what's actually happening on the ground already. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you so much. And sorry again if, I had to change the network again. Sorry, but sometimes we work in this condition. Yes, thank you for the two questions. First of all, about stripping out, the climate problem. Of course, it's not very easy, of course. And you cannot even identify very clearly all the time when hundreds of people, they are moving from one country to another, from one border to another, even outside the G5, the reason why they are moving. Of course, in Africa, it was developed this prima facie recognition of refugee status, and afterwards has been practically applied also in other contexts, also in Asia, for example, but it comes from Africa. In fact, it's the OIU Convention. In brief, it's the 1969 OIU Convention is the only, it was the first, in fact, not now it's not the only, but it was the first legal instrument speaking about this kind of recognition, by which, of course, in the case of conflict, let's take the Sahel. In the case of conflict, in the case of natural disaster, of course, you don't have one family moving. You have hundreds, if not thousands, of families moving from one place to another to try to look access to another country. So at that point, what is the general attitude of the receiving country? Above all in the Sahel, because in the Sahel, I personally spoke with some officer from the government of this country, and they seem to me very will and to try to to improve the system in order to offer, let's say, shelter. So I was saying about this recognition of this prima facie recognition. So what happened? They admit all these hundreds of people coming all together. They're trying first of all to understand why they are fleeing, and of course in this they are also favored in the region. First of all, because the 5 regions, they are all francophone, but moreover, because of course the most part of people moving, they are not very, that we're not talking about the cultural elite of those countries. They speak the same dialect, the same local language, because of course, the porous border comes from the fact that the same ethnic group is divided into more countries. So you may have the Pearl, for example, that the Pearl ethnic group that you can find it in 2 or 3 of the Sahel countries. So it's easier the communication among this population. So they try to understand, first of all, why they are fleeing. And of course, the communication, it will flow quite easily. And at that point, of course, at the moment, if the cause of persecution is the cause of flight, in fact, is within one of the 5 causes of the Refugee Convention. It is also one of the 5 causes that I mentioned, also the OIU Convention. Of course, the path for applying for asylum and obtaining it's much easier. But what generally these countries adopt is, as I mentioned during my presentation, they are temporary solutions. Because in fact, these people, they are moving, they are displaced. Above all, if they do it for natural disaster, they want to go back. Also because, you know, we are not talking here about countries with a very unequal economic indicator. I mean, for some Chadian, going to Burkina or going to Niger is not really going to improve his or her own condition, because, you know, the quality of life in Burkina, the quality of life in Niger or in Mauritania, they are more or less the same. So really, the one who are displaced for climate, for natural disaster, they really want to go back, the most part of them. So what the receiving countries, they're trying to do is really to try, first of all, not to shelter these people very far from the border, because they realize they're not fleeing a conflict. And at that point, you know, they are trying to promote the repatriation that, I mean, not even repatriation in terms of the Refugee Convention. This is just a return. In fact, in this case, you know, we cannot talk all the time about really strictly about refugees. As I said, who are moving, who are displaced for natural disaster in this region, they really want to go back as soon as they can. Afterwards, of course, if the displacement is due by conflict, and of course is known by the authorities of the receiving countries, this is another matter. But that's why I personally think that specifically for this region, I mean, it's, you know, the legal instruments, they're mostly for soft law instruments, they are present in the region, they are more than sufficient. Afterwards, of course, the proposal to amend the Refugee Convention for, I mean, adding some climate, you know, some article that is specifically on natural disaster and climate change, or even to draft a protocol to the Refugee Convention, it can be an idea. But if I'm really thinking of the Sahel region, of these 5 countries that we took into consideration in our research, I don't think is not worthy. I mean, I don't think it's indispensable for these 5 countries, because really, for in the Sahel, people that they are fleeing from natural disaster, they are not really interested in being settled in one of these other Sahel countries, in fact, because as I said, you know, the economic indicator and the level of democracy is not, you know, is not so different. All of these countries, they have problem. They have problem with internal unrest. They are with domestic rebellions. They are increasing, even, I don't know, in Burkina Faso, they are increasing the victims for terrorism in the north. In Mali, we all know what's happening for years, and the situation has not been settled yet. So yeah, I mean, so I really think that the soft law instruments that I couldn't mention in my presentation, because otherwise it would take very long, but they are mentioned in our article. They are more than sufficient to tackle the plight of the displaced person for natural disaster in this region. Afterwards, of course, if we are speaking about Kiribati, but in Africa, we are also having the problem with island that can be submerged. You know, there is the case of Sahel, there is the case of some island in Comoros. They're also running the risk to be, you know, submerged and not to exist anymore. In that case, of course, an amendment of the Refugee Convention, you know, to allow these people who are basically losing their state of origin because it will be submerged by water, it will be very, very important for them to be recognized as refugees in another country, simply because their own state, the state of origin, we won't exist anymore in several decades. But for the Sahel region in particular, I don't think, you know, that, as I said, I think the only thing that they need is of course, is to screen these people and understand why they are fleeing the region. But once that the hosting country realize that they are fleeing a natural disaster, the only thing that he needs to do, if it's is just to provide a temporary protection. If, of course, if the disaster is temporary, the previous situation can be recovered. Of course, otherwise, you know, if it's a fact that there is a, you know, if the land is lost forever, of course, they can understand, they can't even think to offer you know, a definitive settlement in the country in the receiving countries. But otherwise, you know, it's a temporary protection, I think, is more than sufficient in this region. And the last thing, if I can add, that I briefly mentioned before, that of course they can be also considered as refugees, these people, if you can link the natural disaster to one of the causes that are mentioned in the Refugee Convention. Like, for example, it's very famous, the example that happened in Ethiopia during the 70s, while the dictator of that time promoted a famine in several regions of Ethiopia, and this famine obliged people of those regions to flee. At that point, of course, you could link the natural disaster to persecution. That's why refugee status was offered very easily. But in the Sahel at the moment, we are not really having this kind of, you know, we are not having this kind of situation. So people who are displaced because of climate change, they are really displaced only because of climate change and natural disaster. So they cannot really, you cannot really link their situation to, for example, to the conflict, you know, or, I mean, because unless that the conflict ruins completely their own land, the cattle, and obliges them to flee. At that point, of course, the disaster is not natural anymore because it's man-made, provoked. So at that point, of course, it would be for them very easy to obtain refugee status. I don't know if I respond to
Thank you,
your
Cristiano.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Chris, did that answer your question?
Maybe not.
Yes, it did. Fantastic. So I want to, especially you said in the last part, you kind of making this distinction between man-made or human-made disasters and natural disasters. And I think for me personally, one of the key aspects of really, and it ties in also to the idea of sort of what is a climate disaster versus another type of disaster, and when does climate change event turns into disasters and so on. I'm in favor of rejecting the very notion of the naturalness of disasters, and to see disasters as processes that occasionally are triggered by natural hazards, not always, but that always have a very, very strong human aspect to them, because they are deeply economic and political and social as well. And so I'm wondering, once we remove the naturalness out of that, I'm wondering also whether you think that, because that is very different, removing the naturalness from disasters is very different from going as far as into issues around persecution, for example. So there is a space there in between where there is a significant responsibility upon the sort of other states as well, partly in terms of climate change, but also in terms of the way in which certain areas of the world are being exploited, but also responsibility, of course, of governments and so on the ground. So that's one point I'm curious about. I was also wanted to hear more about who is, I guess, a driver for change in the region. What is the role here for example, grassroots organizations in terms of pushing and advocating for change, and what are their kind of position in this? That would be interesting to hear. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. You probably heard about this project that is called the Green Wall. In fact, that it was promoted by China. That of course is a project that of course in some way should limit the natural disaster in the region, but it is not clear yet if it's also how much is reducing the danger of natural disaster on one side, and on the other side, for example, it's not really clear how much it creates pollution. I agree with you with the fact that often this natural disaster are provoked in some way by human. The problem is that often you cannot really know if there was a will to do that. I mean, you don't know. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to blame, for example, a government or a company for something happening in this region, in the sense that you should really be aware that the company polluted, for example, an area on purpose. But there are not legal cases registered at the moment, official legal cases, but there have been cases, of course, of companies. For example, in Niger is very rich of uranium, and of course there is all this problem linked to the exploitation of the uranium mines that also is provoking a number of consequences, natural consequences in the environment, in the neighboring environment. The issue is that always that you have to find, you have to adjudicate, you have to find someone guilty for that. And at the moment, in a way or in another, it is not easy, not even for the organization on the ground to take, for example, private companies, and most part of them, they're foreign, of course, they're not local, and often they're not even Africans. It's very difficult to take these companies to a trial, for example, because afterwards, of course, there are political implications in all this. And this is, in fact, this is in the region, not only in the region, but also in this region, but also elsewhere in Africa, a big issue. I know, for example, that the changing region, but still in Africa, several years ago, there was a case in Zambia of in Zambia there is a copper belt, so there is the copper that it's many mines that are in the hand of Chinese companies, and there was a natural disaster in copper belt, and several organizations, several association of local people with several NGO, they managed to to claim and to take this company before a Zambian judge to say, look, this is the problem. This was the disaster, and we have the proof that that the Chinese company provoked this disaster. But unfortunately, the judges said that they didn't find the guilt of the Chinese company, and of course there were rumors that the judge was corrupted, this and that. It was never proved, of course. But this is the only at the moment case that I have in mind that happened in Africa of private company, because of course they are them, they're not region, and they are not governments. The government of Niger, of the government of Chad, they don't even have the means to, to pollute the environment, or to, as I said, the only way that they can do is was done in Ethiopia to provoke famine, but at the moment this is not the case in the Sahel. So
thank you for that. I'm mindful of time, so maybe if you could just jump into
Sure.
the second question.
Okay.
Because I know people are already having to leave, I think.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Who is the driving of? Who is the driving?
What is the role for? What is the role for the grassroots kind of?
I mean well, I mean it will be very important. The problem that at the moment there is no really, the government, they are taking the helm at the moment. They are the only one who are I mean they're not very much helped in the region by anyone, in the sense that they prefer to run the situation independently. Of course, because they have a lot of because, as I said, there is a lot of empathy. They have a lot of similarities. The countries. So until now, they found agreements on how to try to deal the entire situation in the region. And of course of course it's problematic. I mean, of course, it's at the moment you don't see any solution in sight, because of course, also because naturally Sahel per se is a very dry. I mean, it doesn't have a very fortunate climate. So of course these people, they are obliged to cope with already the natural situation, the natural conditions on the ground. But I can tell, I mean, as far as I know, as far as I could see, because I also travel in a couple of these countries before the pandemic, I see that there is, there is the will to try to tackle the problem differently from other problems in other regions of Africa. In this specific region, for this particular problem, I saw that there is really the will by the government to try to solve the problem. I mean, that was something that I was positively, I was positively impressed to see how governments in this specific case they really want to tackle and solve the problem. Actually,
that's great to hear. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? In case you haven't looked at the chat, there have been Samuel mentioned a recent study that was on claimed refugee status in Sweden and Austria based on climate related challenges. I put in a link to that report as well, and also anyone who's interested, I think if you haven't already, you might be interested to also go in and look at the Nansen Initiative and the Disaster Displacement Platform, which talks about displacement, more cross-border specifically, displacement due to disasters and climate change. We also have a question for Cristiano from Sam in the chat. It's been suggested that ECOWAS regional free movement agreement might provide a solution to slow onset displacement in particular. What are your thoughts on this? Are the RFM protocols provisions adequately implemented, and do people de facto have access to work settlement, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, it's well, I mean, there is first of all, there is this problem that not the 5 countries, they belong to ECOWAS in any case. So, but of course in ECOWAS, it's under this point of view, it's the most developed region of Africa, because it was the one that managed to, not without problems, in fact, allow people to move. And I know, for example, the problem for the practical problem, for example, if you see the map of Africa, you will see that these countries, the Sahel countries, they border with a huge country like Nigeria, above all in the north of Nigeria. But all knows, for example, the northern Nigeria for years now is under the control, the most part of the north is under the control of Boko Haram. So, for example, it's one of the practical problems for these people is from people from Burkina or from Mali, for example, is how I can enter Nigeria if I mean it's not practicable for me to go to Nigeria, even if, because I cannot enter from the north, of course. And so even if on paper it has been shown, it has been demonstrated that there is in fact exchange of of people, freedom of movement, but this in particular case is a bit difficult because not because the country they don't want to receive Sahelian people, but as I said, there is a practical problem with Nigeria. Many of them they try to enter to Senegal, but also to Senegal, of course, the main problem is always how to receive these people, because all these countries, they, of course, if something is to move, if a singular is an individual or a family is moving from one country to another for work reasons, that is okay. It would be much easier in the ECOWAS area, but when it comes from receiving hundreds of thousands of people moving from one country to another at the same time, you also need to observe the capacity of these other countries to receive this huge amount of people that comes to your border at the same time. What you can offer to them? Can you really host them at least provisionally? Can you, in case, offer them a good future in case they cannot go back? I mean, and these are huge problems, because, as I said, we are talking about countries that they have already their own problems, and all of them they have economies that they don't allow the reception of many people in need, in fact. So that's it's I mean, in spite of the fact that we have the agreement in the ECOWAS, freedom of movement, etc., but the freedom of movement was conceived mostly for qualified people, for workers, was not conceived thinking that you could have received hundreds or thousands of people that they are moving because of conflict or because of climate, of natural disaster. And because this posed a number of unresolved questions for those countries until now.
Thank you, Cristiano. That's fantastic.
Well,
Sam, does that answer your question? Yes, that was very helpful. Fantastic. Thank you, Sam. Do we have any? I can see that Chris, I think that probably Chris, is that a question for me, more about a discussion about the naturalness of disasters, which I'm very happy to have, but I feel like that might sidetrack the discussion a little bit. I can just briefly touch upon it, about what benefits there would be, for example, to highlight the human aspect in a flood. In my view, and I think increasingly, I'm personally coming from the position of trying to engage more and more with critical disaster studies as well, and disaster risk creation and understanding where risk comes from. So for me, really acknowledging the human aspects in any type of disaster is critical in order to prevent them from happening in the first place. So that's really, it's not just about necessarily classification for displaced, but it's rather about obligations to prevent both the effects of, but also the very hazards in the first place. So in terms of floods, there's so much going into the creation of a flood, in terms of the natural environment, in terms of where we build, planning laws, and so on, in addition to, for example, more clear-cut issues around evacuations and so forth. So I think it's really important, because once we step away from seeing disasters as events that just happen and we start seeing them as processes, we can really open up the space for exploring the role of the law in the various steps of that creation and in its consequences as well. So that's really where I'm coming from with that. Does anyone have any final question for Cristiano? This has been an amazing, we know we've kept you very long now. This has been a really amazing, amazing 75 minutes. Any final questions? I don't see any hands. Well, do you have anything else you want to say, Cristiano?
No, I know that I want to say, but you know, I just got the final reflection of Susan, that I don't know, because I had problem with connection. So I don't know if you're still connected, because it seems to me very interesting, and I would have liked to share my views.
Susan
but I
is
don't know
still
if
here.
she's connected. If you want to repeat, please, because I lost 4 minutes.
Thanks, Cristiano, but you were answering my question, because it was this issue, and then Chris Hilson and I got into it about whether, you know, refugees should be expanded to climate refugees, and or whether there should be a freestanding international convention. Marie and Chris know me well, and I'm kind of an international law junkie. I tend to think that treaties help, but I can be proved wrong. I mean, I know that the work that's being done regionally is important, but looking at it from the European perspective, there isn't anything to force Europeans to recognize what climate change is doing to the world. And, you know, the issue of responsibility that Marie has just been talking about in disasters is a process. I mean, part of this process is that because of climate change, we have to take responsibility. It's not the problem of Africa to deal with it on its own. This is an international issue that has been caused, quite frankly, by the global north, much more so than the global south. So that's why I tend to do that. But I thought your presentation really just provoked that thought in me, is how do you deal with this? And just to put it in context, I mean, over 30,000 people have drowned in the Mediterranean trying to seek shelter. You don't do that. You don't get on those small boats. I just don't agree with this argument that it's for economic benefit.
No, but it's not, Susan. I mean, you know, the question is, you know, me, I have a very Pan-Africanist view on that, and I'm fighting against this European view for years, wherever, you know, before I can. You know, the premise is that no one is putting at risk his or her life if he doesn't have a reason to do that. So of course, all these people live in their own houses, and then they crossing the desert. They running the risk, you know, to be beaten and tortured in the Libyan camp. Of course, they take the risk because they have nothing to lose, and it's often what Europeans they don't understand. But there is, look, I know there is also a lot of ignorance among the Europeans. I mean, of course, not at the high level, not among academics, but I'm saying, people from in the street. I was involved in several debates on this in Europe, above all in the southern, in Spain, in France, and many people they continue to say that these guys crossing the Mediterranean, they shouldn't do that because there is no reason for them to do that. They can stay to their own country. Now, you know, the Ukrainian war is even worse in the situation, because they say, look, you see, the Ukrainians, they are fighting for their own country. Why, if there is a conflict in Boko Haram, these people, they don't fight in Nigeria and they try to flee? They should be, but they don't understand a number of things about Africa. They don't understand that, you know, this is the usual European vision by which they think that the rest of the world is like Europe. They don't understand that in Africa, for example, the border they've been imposed. They don't understand that in Africa, there is no the sense of nation that you have in Europe, because it's very important. It's much more important the ethnic group than the nation, and the same ethnic group is shared in 3 or 4 countries. So someone living in the north of Nigeria, he doesn't care about Nigeria, but possibly he cares more about the same ethnic group living in Niger and Chad. They don't understand that. They don't understand. They don't know that. It's not even they don't understand that. But even if you try to explain, it's very difficult, because when you think that the entire world is like you are, and the entire world should think like you think, and the entire world should share the values that you are sharing, it's very difficult to let them understand that it's not like this. I mean, different parts of the world, and for me, I'm talking about Africa because I'm an expert of Africa, and is the continent I know better, but I'm sure in Asia it would be the same. You cannot think as a European when you approach African issues, but there's always this kind of superiority thing, like it's the neo-colonialism. Okay, well, I don't want to, but colonialism never ended. The fact that the 90% of companies acting in Africa, they're not Africans. We can talk for hours about that, but it's yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to let understand normal, people from the street that the situation in Africa is not exactly how they think, how they perceive, and but yeah, it's a very problematic. I mean, it's because afterwards they start saying that all these companies and they're helping the migrants. It's them. They are smugglers. They are not. They help smugglers, so they in themselves they are smugglers, so they are not saving lives. They even on figures, they feel invaded while they don't even know that the 85% of Africans who are moving, they remain in Africa. So there's not this big wave of Africans invading Europe, but we should explain the basic to people. But if the audience don't want to listen because they have already their own response, it's very difficult to let them understand that the reality is different from what they think.
Thank you, Cristiano.
You're welcome.
That was really, that was really fantastic. And I think there's a lot of things to be said as well for how we categorize migrants and actually what an economic migrant might be. It sounds like it's someone who just wants more cash, but often it's actually about basic sustenance and coming back to that sort of Alexander's Betts kind of concept of survival migrants, for example. And I think that's also important to keep in mind. Thank you so much to everyone and everyone who stayed with us. A specific thank you. Of course, I would like to hand over, a sort of a nice little thank you gift to you now, Cristiano. I obviously can't for obvious reasons, but at the very least, a round of applause, please, for our speaker. Thank you so much. It's been fantastic, and thank you to all for sticking around, for your questions and for engaging. Please keep an eye on the website. I know that Holly will keep on. We have more seminars coming up as well. So if you haven't already, please head over to disasterlaw.net and you can sign up to receive our newsletter as well. And just keep an eye on the events page there, because we are kicking things off now for the what I would say the European and American summer season and the New Zealand winter, I guess.
Yeah,
so keep an eye out.
Of our next seminar, we've actually got 2 confirmed. So our next one will be in June, and it is looking at regional responses to COVID-19. So I've got a lady called Pauline who's coming and talking about the Philippines, and then Benjamin, who works for the Singapore Management University, is going to come and talk about COVID-19 responses in Singapore, and they've both updated their articles for me, and Pauline works for IEFASI, so it's really exciting. So definitely keep an eye out.
Thank you, Holly. So thank you all. And I think we can probably stop the recording now, but the recording I think will be made available. So thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much, Marie.